The phone rang just after 6 p.m. Richard's hands shook as he picked it up, a voice on the other side coldly informing him that his career had been destroyed. It was a voice he knew all too well. John, his closest friend. "It's over, Richard. You're done," John said with a mix of satisfaction and contempt. Richard felt the world collapse around him, disbelief washing over his face. His mind raced. Had John truly done this? How could a friendship built over years end like this with one phone call? Richard struggled to process the words, his pulse quickening. His heart pounded as the weight of the betrayal sank in, and a cold resolve began to form within him. He would find out how John had orchestrated this, and why. There was no turning back now. A line had been crossed. The phone call had left Richard in shock. But now, he sat at his desk, his mind racing. The betrayal felt unreal. John, his closest friend for years, had done this. He had orchestrated the downfall of everything Richard had worked for. It was impossible to understand. They had shared dreams, ambitions, moments of victory and defeat. Richard recalled the times when John had been the first to cheer him on, offering advice and support when needed. But now it all felt like a lie. Richard thought back to their last conversation, trying to find the moment where everything had gone wrong, searching for a clue, a hint of what was to come. How could it all unravel so suddenly, so coldly? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Richard's mind refused to stop racing. He tried to piece together the events of the last few weeks. Was there something he missed? He hadn't seen any signs of John's resentment or ambition, nothing to suggest betrayal. Yet, the message was clear. John had planned this all along. Richard tried to contact their mutual friends, hoping someone might offer an explanation. But the silence was deafening. He searched for any hint, any shred of proof that could shed light on John's true motives. Richard's thoughts wandered back to the office where they had spent countless hours working together, brainstorming ideas and sharing dreams of future success. How could this man, who had been more like a brother than a friend, turn his back on him so ruthlessly? It was time to stop questioning and start investigating. Richard's resolve hardened. He would find out everything, and make John pay for destroying everything he had worked for. By the following morning, Richard had made up his mind. It was no longer about saving his career. It was about justice. The world John had created with his lies and manipulation was crumbling. Richard had to act fast. He began gathering everything: emails, files, and conversations. His office, once a place of collaboration and productivity, now felt like a battleground, every document a potential weapon in his war. He'd have to be careful. John's influence reached far and wide, and Richard knew one wrong move could lead to his undoing. But the anger, the betrayal, had taken root deep inside him. Richard wasn't going to be a victim any longer. He would find out exactly how John had orchestrated this, and he would make sure John paid for the destruction he had caused. Richard's journey of revenge was only beginning, and he knew it would come at a cost. As the day wore on, Richard's search for answers grew more desperate. He had uncovered a few hidden emails and a series of text messages from John, all pointing to a carefully laid-out plan to ruin Richard's reputation. But there was still one crucial piece missing. Why? What had driven John to destroy their friendship and Richard's career? Richard knew he had to confront John. He couldn't go on living with the uncertainty. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface was now bubbling over. It was no longer about the job. It was about the betrayal. It was about John's need to take everything from him. Richard's phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. He looked down at the screen and saw a text from John. "We need to talk." Richard's fingers tightened around the phone. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Richard spent the following days buried in research. Emails, phone logs, and social media accounts were scrutinized for any clue about John's motives. Every detail he uncovered seemed to lead back to one conclusion. John had been planning this for months. But what made Richard's stomach turn was the discovery of John's ambition. It was all about power. Richard had been nothing more than a stepping stone. The realization hit hard. John wasn't just his friend. He was someone who saw Richard as an obstacle to his own success. Richard paused, leaning back in his chair, unable to escape the burning sensation of betrayal that now lingered in his chest. As Richard dug deeper, he began to notice a pattern in the emails. John had manipulated every conversation, positioning Richard as a fall guy when things went wrong. It was clear now that John had been using Richard as a pawn, orchestrating everything from the shadows. Richard's anger flared as he imagined the countless hours they had spent together, trusting each other. But those memories now seemed like a cruel joke. His fingers trembled as he clicked on another email, this one even more incriminating than the last. The truth was unfolding, and Richard could feel the walls closing in on him. He couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. Richard's heart raced when he uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. A private conversation between John and a business associate. The email contained a list of steps John had taken to ensure Richard's downfall, including planting false evidence and spreading rumors. Richard could feel the blood rushing to his head as the magnitude of John's betrayal sunk in. This wasn't just about business. It was personal. He thought back to all the moments they had shared, laughing and supporting each other. But now, those moments were tainted, their friendship reduced to nothing but a strategic move in John's grand plan. Richard closed his laptop, taking a deep breath as his mind processed what he had just found. Richard knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone who could help him piece together the final details. That's when he reached out to Carla, an old colleague who had been working at a different firm, but knew the ins and outs of corporate espionage. He met her at a quiet cafe, far from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. "John's not just playing games with you, Richard. He's playing a much bigger one," Carla said, her voice low but intense. Richard leaned forward, listening intently as she laid out her suspicions about John's broader network. "You're going after him. You need to be ready for what's coming next." Richard nodded, feeling a mix of dread and determination. He wasn't backing down now. With Carla's help, Richard began assembling the pieces of John's plan. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that John had not only betrayed Richard, but had aligned himself with people who could ruin not just Richard's career, but anyone who stood in his way. "John's got too many connections. If you want to take him down, you'll have to move fast," Carla advised. Richard nodded, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. His mind was already running through the possible steps. He had to act quickly. Every moment of delay made him more vulnerable. The confrontation was inevitable, and Richard was ready. There was no turning back now. Richard knew that confronting John directly would be a mistake. His best chance was to gather more intel, find out exactly who John was working with. That's when he crossed paths with Marcus, a former colleague who had witnessed John's rise firsthand. Marcus was the kind of man who knew the underground world of business deals and power plays. "John's playing a bigger game than you realize, Richard," Marcus warned, his eyes darting around nervously as they met in a secluded alley behind a restaurant. He's got people backing him. People you don't want to mess with." Richard's mind raced as he processed Marcus' words. It was becoming clear. This wasn't just about business anymore. John had allies, dangerous ones, and Richard was now a target in a much larger scheme. The warning from Marcus hit Richard hard. He spent the next few days on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering who else was working with John. Richard knew he needed to form alliances of his own. He contacted an old friend, Lena, a former investigator who specialized in corporate espionage. "You're digging into the wrong people, Richard. "You're opening doors you can't close," Lena told him over the phone. Her voice was stern but laced with concern. "John isn't just any businessman. He's got connections that go beyond what you can imagine. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Richard's reply was simple but resolute. "I don't have a choice anymore. I need to bring him down." As Richard prepared to take the next step, he realized the true extent of the danger he was in. It wasn't just John anymore. It was everyone John had aligned himself with. To Richard's growing horror, he learned that John's associates weren't just business rivals. They were people who controlled information, power, and influence at the highest levels. The more Richard uncovered, the more he understood how deep John's reach really was. "This is bigger than you think, Richard," Carla said one evening as they pored over their findings. "John isn't just playing for money, he's playing for control. And he won't stop until he has it all." Richard's growing suspicions about John were confirmed when he received an anonymous tip. The message was short and cryptic. "John's got someone in your office. Watch your back." Panic surged through Richard's chest, but he quickly suppressed it. He couldn't afford to be reckless now. He began watching his every move, his eyes scanning the faces of his colleagues for signs of betrayal. He kept his distance, not trusting anyone, not even those he had once considered allies. The walls felt like they were closing in, but Richard wasn't going to back down. The tip had confirmed it. John's influence was everywhere. The more Richard delved into his investigation, the clearer it became. He was no longer just fighting for his career. He was fighting for his life. With every passing day, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on. The people John had aligned himself with were dangerous, powerful, and ruthless. Richard knew that if he was going to survive this, he had to act quickly. It was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about staying one step ahead. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. John had already taken everything from him, and Richard would not let him take more. Richard's investigation had led him to an unexpected breakthrough. A secret document hidden deep within John's files. The document was a blueprint, a detailed plan that exposed John's dark strategy. It outlined how John had manipulated key people in Richard's life, orchestrated lies, and planted false evidence to sabotage Richard's career. As Richard read through the chilling details, his mind raced. This wasn't just about corporate power. It was about control, about using others as pawns to climb higher. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the depth of John's betrayal. The stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. John had been playing a dangerous game all along, and now Richard had the weapon he needed to take him down. As Richard sat with the document in front of him, he knew this was the turning point. But the deeper he looked, the more complicated the situation became. The document revealed not just John's betrayal, but his involvement with people in high places. People who had the power to destroy Richard completely. It was clear now that John had anticipated every move Richard might make. His control wasn't just financial. It was personal, leveraging people's weaknesses to his advantage. Richard's fingers trembled as he carefully examined every name and every date. He could feel his resolve harden. It was time to confront John, but this time, Richard would be ready. Richard's next step was to confront John, but he knew this would be no easy task. John had always been one step ahead, and now Richard was playing catch-up. Armed with the newfound evidence, he prepared to meet with Carla again. "This is bigger than you think," Carla warned him, her voice sharp with concern. "John has connections you can't even begin to understand. He won't go down easily." But Richard wasn't listening. The rage within him had reached its peak. "I don't care what it takes," Richard replied coldly. "He's going to pay for everything." Carla's worried look lingered, but she said nothing more. It was clear that Richard had made up his mind. The time for words was over. The confrontation was inevitable. The confrontation with John was set for the following evening. Richard couldn't afford any more delays, but as the time drew closer, doubt crept into his mind. What if John wasn't alone? What if the connections he had made were even more dangerous than Richard had anticipated? He spent the evening preparing, going over the document again and again, making sure every detail was in place. "I have to be ready for anything," Richard muttered to himself, his face etched with determination. As the clock ticked down, the only thing on his mind was bringing John to justice, no matter the cost. The night of the confrontation finally arrived. Richard entered the dimly lit conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that this was the endgame. As John stepped into the room, his usual confident demeanor faltered just slightly when he saw Richard standing there, the document in Richard's hand. "You've been digging, haven't you?" John sneered. Richard held up the paper, his voice calm but filled with anger. "This ends tonight, John. You're going to pay for what you did to me." John's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You really think you can take me down? You've only just begun to understand what's at stake." Richard stepped forward, unshaken. "I'm done being your pawn." Richard had thought that confronting John would bring him a sense of closure, but instead he was left with an unsettling feeling. The document was in his hands, and yet John wasn't defeated. Not yet. The confrontation had only intensified Richard's anger, but something deeper was troubling him. As he sat in his office later that night, alone with his thoughts, his phone buzzed with a message from Lena. "You're crossing the line, Richard. Revenge won't fix what's broken." Richard stared at the words, feeling a gnawing sense of doubt. Was he becoming just like John, driven by vengeance instead of justice? The line between right and wrong seemed to blur with every step he took. His quest for retribution had consumed him, but at what cost? Richard couldn't ignore Lena's words. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his pursuit of vengeance was beginning to consume him. The rage that had once fueled his every action was now clouding his judgment. He wasn't sure if he was fighting for justice anymore, or just trying to bring down someone who had hurt him. The pain of betrayal still burned deep inside him, but now he wondered whether exacting his revenge would truly make him feel whole again. "What if I'm becoming the villain in this story?" he wondered aloud, his voice filled with doubt. He had been so focused on taking John down, he hadn't stopped to consider what it would mean for him afterward. The next day, Carla met with Richard in person, sensing the turmoil in him. "You're not the same person you were before this all started," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've seen it in your eyes. You've become obsessed with bringing John down, but is it worth losing yourself in the process?" Richard didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew she was right. He had changed. The person he was before the betrayal, someone who valued fairness, justice, and loyalty, felt like a distant memory. The path of revenge had twisted him into something darker. Carla's words stung, but they also rang true. Richard realized he had to decide: continue down this path, or find a way to redeem himself. Richard spent the following night alone in his office, staring at the document once more. His finger traced the names on the paper, each one representing a step John had taken to destroy him. His anger flared up again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, his career, and his sense of self. But as he read the final lines of the document, a new thought entered his mind. If he used this evidence, would he be any better than John? Would he be playing the same game, just with different rules? Richard sighed deeply, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision he had to make. The road ahead was unclear, but he couldn't afford to lose himself in the process. After a sleepless night, Richard made a decision. He wouldn't let revenge consume him. He would bring John to justice, but not at the cost of his own soul. The evidence he had gathered would be used to expose John's actions, but Richard would walk away from this battle, not as a man driven by anger, but as someone who had regained control of his life. He called Carla to tell her his decision, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. "I'm going to do this the right way," Richard said, his voice steady. "No more games, no more vengeance. Just justice." Richard's decision was made. The evidence was in his hands, and he knew it was time to face John once and for all. He met Carla one last time before the confrontation. "I'm ready," Richard said, his voice unwavering. Carla looked at him, her expression filled with a mix of concern and relief. "Just remember, Richard, this isn't just about you anymore. You're not fighting just for yourself. You're fighting to stop someone who's hurt a lot of people." Richard nodded. "I know. This ends tonight." With that, they parted ways, and Richard made his way to the meeting location. His mind was clear now. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the truth. Richard entered the dimly lit warehouse where the meeting was set. He could hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance, but the silence between him and John was deafening. John was already there, standing by a table covered in documents, his back turned. Richard's pulse quickened as he approached. "I knew you'd come eventually," John said, his voice cold and confident. "You think this is over, but it's just beginning." Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, placing the document on the table between them. "It's over, John," Richard said, his voice steady. "Your game ends here." John's smirk faded as Richard revealed the full extent of his knowledge. "You never thought I'd catch on, did you?" Richard said, his voice now firm and unwavering. "I've got everything, John. The emails, the conversations, the lies. It's all here." John's eyes flickered with frustration, but he quickly masked it with a false smile. "You think you've won, Richard?" he sneered. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you're up against." Richard took a step forward, his anger boiling over. "It ends now, John. I'm not backing down anymore." John's facade cracked for a moment, his eyes narrowing in rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed. As the confrontation escalated, Richard's words hit John like a punch to the gut. John's calm demeanor shattered, replaced with frantic defensiveness. "You think you can just walk away from this?" John spat. "I've built everything I have on lies and manipulation. You're nothing but a tool, Richard." The words stung, but they only strengthened Richard's resolve. He had heard enough. With a swift motion, Richard placed the document in front of John, slamming it onto the table. "The truth is out. It's over." John recoiled, his face contorted with rage, but Richard stood firm. "You've lost," he said, his voice low but final. "There's no more running." John's eyes burned with fury as he looked at Richard, but there was no escape. The damage had been done. The truth was now in the open, and John's empire of lies was crumbling. As Richard stood there, watching John's facade break down, he realized that this wasn't the victory he had imagined. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt relief. "You're finished," Richard said softly, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. John's expression darkened further, and for a moment it seemed as though he would lash out, but he said nothing. He knew it was over. Richard turned and walked away, leaving John standing in the ruin of his own deceit. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and quiet reflection. Richard had won, but the victory didn't bring the sense of triumph he had expected. John was now publicly exposed, his empire of lies crumbling under the weight of truth. Yet, as Richard sat in his office, looking out over the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had changed forever. He had avenged his career, but at what cost? His thoughts drifted to Carla's words. "You're not the same person you were." She was right. The fire for vengeance had transformed him, and though he had won, Richard now faced the reality of living with the aftermath of his actions. Richard met with Lena later that week. They sat in a quiet cafe, the atmosphere starkly different from the tense environment they had once shared. "So it's done," Lena said, taking a sip of her coffee. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's done?" But even as he spoke, he realized he wasn't sure what done really meant. John was finished, but the scars left on Richard's soul were still raw. Lena looked at him with understanding. "You know, you've got a chance to start fresh, but it's going to take time." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start." He wasn't sure if redemption was even possible after everything he had done. But Lena's words gave him a glimmer of hope. Days passed, and Richard began the slow process of rebuilding his life. The media coverage surrounding John's fall had quieted, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Richard had lost a part of himself in the pursuit of justice, but he was starting to understand that the battle wasn't just against John. It was against the darkness inside him. One night, as Richard walked along the city streets, he reflected on the choices he had made. He had fought so hard for something that he thought would bring him peace. But the fight had only led him deeper into turmoil. Now he realized that true peace would come only from within, from letting go of the past and moving forward. Richard received a call from Carla the next day. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked. Richard hesitated, the question hanging in the air. What was next for him? The battle was over, but the journey of healing had just begun. "I think so," Richard replied, his voice steady but unsure. "It's going to take time, but I'm ready to move on." Carla's voice softened. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. There are people who care about you." Richard smiled faintly, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Carla. I think I'm starting to realize that now." With that, they said their goodbyes, and Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild what had been lost. The final step of Richard's journey was one of quiet reflection. Standing by the window of his office, he looked out over the city, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The battle was over. John was defeated, and Richard had found a path forward. But now, it was time to let go of the past. The journey to redemption had been long and painful, but Richard had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more aware of his own limitations. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of peace. He had done what he had set out to do, but he knew the real work was just beginning. It was time to rebuild, not just his career, but his life.